Welcome. My name is Daniel Immervar. I'm a professor at Northwestern University and the author of a book called How to Hide an Empire. And I want to thank you for joining us for our conversation with Brown University's Samuel "Sandy" Zipp. Before we do that, I'd like to just make a few housekeeping announcements before we jump in. First of all, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which is hosting this, is independent and nonpartisan, and therefore the views that you will hear expressed are Professor Zipp's and perhaps mine as well, but they are not those of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We are on the record, which means that we are recording this conversation, and it will go up on the Council's website and also on social media. And that means also if you want to, you like the conversation, you want other people to hear it, you can sort of pass that on and broadcast it via social media. So what we'll do is we'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then just Professor Zipp and I, and then we will take questions. So there is a website where you can submit and vote on questions. It's ccga.live. So Chicago Council on Global Affairs, ccga.live. So whenever you're moved, just put up a question up there, and then after about half an hour, we'll start turning to those questions. So submit questions, vote on questions, and that'll keep the conversation going. Okay, so I'd like to now introduce Professor Zipp, who writes under the name Samuel Zipp, but goes by Sandy Zipp, and I might call him that as I know him. He's an associate professor of American Studies and Urban Studies at Brown University. And Sandy's someone whom I've known for a while as in the capacity of an admirer. I've liked his writings for quite some time. I really liked his first book about urban renewal in New York City called Manhattan Projects. And then since then, he's been writing this other book about Wendell Willkie, and I've gotten to see him sort of release parts of it as conference papers or as articles. One of those articles I assigned to my students at Northwestern who study U.S. foreign relation, and they really get a lot out of it. So I have been waiting eagerly for years for this book, The Idealist, which is finally available, and we are going to talk about it. And when I say that it is available, I should also say it is not, just in case you wanted to know what two of them looked like. When I say this book is available, it's not just available in general, it is also available to you specifically because Chicago Council on Global Affairs is partnered with the bookseller and will supply a link through Zoom where you can purchase the book immediately if you are moved by our conversation. And I hope you are, because it's a really terrific book. Okay, so without more ado, I'd like to turn to Professor Zipp. And, Sandy, just first ask you, who is Wendell Willkie? This is a biography of Wendell Willkie, a person of whom some people might not have heard. So tell us about Wendell Willkie. What drew you to him? Did you write a book about him, and why should we read that book?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Daniel, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Chicago Council for having me. I really appreciate the chance to talk about this book, which was something of a quixotic endeavor for me. Someone who's trained as an urban and cultural historian with an interest in the sort of global impact of American cultural life in the 20th century and its global sort of reverberations of the United States. But I came to Willkie because I think that he's a sort of unexplained and underunderstood figure, I guess, if that's really a word, from the middle of the 20th century, right? So Willkie was, for most of his life, was a lawyer, and then an official kind of corporate head in a utility industry. This is up until the late 1930s. And he comes to the public eye, and this is how most people have come to know about him. He comes into the public eye when he testifies in Congress against the New Deal and particularly against the Tennessee Valley Authority, because it's an infringement on the utility holding company that he works for. So he's a Democrat, but he's something of an odd bird and something of an anti-New Deal Democrat for what he believes it to be its infringement on free enterprise. This attracts a whole host of Republicans who want him to run as a liberal Republican against Roosevelt in 1940. And this is how most people know about Willkie. He is the candidate in 1940, defeated by Roosevelt, but who makes the best showing of any Republican candidate against against Roosevelt. But what interested me about him is something slightly different, right? Is something that happens after that event, and something that I think Wilkie himself considered to be the most important episode of his career. So really my book, The Idealist, is about this episode, right? It tells you a lot about Wilkie and where he came from and his idiosyncratic personality, his kind of iconoclasm, the way he came up as a sort of prairie populist, but ended up as a businessman in the 1930s who ended up as an anti-New Deal businessman. But it also sets the stage for his kind of iconoclastic version of internationalism. His Wilsonian internationalism when he was young, the way that he grows and expands that. And by the time of the mid-1940s during the war, he becomes the avatar of this new idea of what he calls one world, which is a idea that's held by a lot of people, but he becomes the kind of central figure in this sort of new vision of how to orient the United States to the rest of the world, mostly through the lens of this trip that he takes around the world in 1942, in partnership with Roosevelt, but he quickly exceeds the expectations that Roosevelt has for that trip. That trip is really at the heart of the book, and then the reception of that trip and his big best-selling book, One World, in 1943. And it's really the book about the rise and fall of his kind of progressive, anti-racist, and anti-imperial vision for the United States in the years between 1942 and 1944, when he unexpectedly and at a very early age dies of a heart attack.
Great. So let's start with that trip, and I'm going to attempt an act of technological proficiency by sharing a map that appeared as the frontispiece in Wendell Willkie's book. And maybe it's such a striking visual image, and you talk a little bit about the map as image in this book. So I'm wondering, once I've sort of shown this, if you could just talk us through this map and what you see on it, or what kind of a trip this is.
Yeah, sure. So this is, I think, a fascinating document because it gets really at why Willkie's interesting, right? He sits at the heart of a whole series of dilemmas that face Americans during World War II. And this map shows the route of his journey, beginning in New York and Washington, and then circling the globe, and returning him to Washington 49 days later in the fall of 1942. This map partakes of a whole series of conventions of map making that were quite popular during the war. The sort of a polar view of the Earth, right, showing the Earth as a place that was more unbounded than it had been before, right? And it was a kind of vision that was quite popular in maps and other popular map-making exercises that hung on walls and classrooms all over the country in these years. And this is one of the most popular of those visions, right? The flight of the Gulliver, not across states and borders, but across this kind of expanse of space that is joined by the trajectory of his flight. And so in some sense, this is the imagination of a world that is less bounded, right? Less caught up in nationalistic ideals or nationalistic visions for shaping foreign policy, right? The one world, the kind of universalism of that title. At the same time, it's a complex vision because it doesn't quite reveal the ways that Willkie and many other people who were interested in this vision continue to struggle with how to place the United States in this view, right? How to see whether how to try to think through whether the United States was indispensable to this new world, or whether the United States could find a way to cooperate in an interdependent way with the rest of the world. So this image is, I think, a key to understanding not just the shape of Willkie's voyage, but the shape of the ideas that were at play in this period, and that Willkie is an important lens into, one that's, I think, been unjustly forgotten.
One thing you noted in the book is that Willkie talks about what it would be like to imagine a world that, when we pictured it, it wasn't the splotches of color that represent different countries. And a really striking thing on this map, which I hadn't thought through until I read you talking about it, was that there are no national borders on this map. In fact, the lines you see are the lines of connection, not the lines of division. So what he's showing you is how you can get from one place to another, but not the political borders that might stop you from doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. And this map shows in some ways how Willkie became a great avatar of that vision, of a kind of universalist ideal that shared a certain kind of vision of American power in the world after the war, for some that was a problem. For some that was its bet. That was something that was good about it. But what it also shows is this sort of idea that he was going to place himself at the center of this problem, the trajectory of his journey, and that he was going to become an avatar of this kind of a feeling that people could share about worldliness in this period, right? A really cosmopolitan vision that Americans in particular needed to challenge themselves to share against the lines of nationalism, against the lines of race that had shaped so much of Americans' conceptions of the world that had been shaped by European empire, and that they were poised to inherit at this kind of hinge moment in world history.
So a question that you've kind of asked or you've teased is, is this really just one world where everyone is connected, or is this a world where the United States is central? What's the place of the United States in the world? What's the place of Wilkie in this? And I want to return to that. But before we do, I want to ask this. One thing that really was extraordinary to me about this book was how popular Wilkie is. I mean, the guy is enormously popular. It seems worldwide. I mean, not universally, but largely. And he's popular in the United States. So what's going on with that? Why is he so popular at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I'm interested in this book. This is why part of the reason I wrote this book was to try to tease out all the different textures of the popular internationalism that I think Wilkie kind of shows us was active in American political culture during the war. And you can get a sense from, first of all, the book itself, One World, which tells the story of this journey, which had been tracked in newspapers and magazines as he went around the world too, becomes one of these kind of dramas of the war years. It's mostly forgotten now. It features in histories of World War II sometimes here and there, but mostly as a sort of domestic story. But really what it was an international story about how the world at large was waiting on the United States to fulfill dreams, the freedom dreams of many people around the world. And Americans themselves, it seems, greeting the world through Wilkie's itinerary, right? 7 countries in the Middle East, China and the Soviet Union, right? And the experiences he had there, the ways that he narrated his story in a kind of very popular voice, kind of like a mass magazine voice, right? Meeting people on equal terms, thinking about them as equal to Americans rather than as sort of subject to Americans' dictates, right? And also his encounters with world leaders, right? With Charles de Gaulle, with Joseph Stalin, with Chiang Kai-shek and the rest of the Chinese ruling class whom he was somewhat taken with. These set of stories are these kinds of romantic stories for Americans, which partake of some of the unfortunate kinds of genres of sort of travel writing, but on the other hand are about how Americans might start to think about a kind of equal relationship with the rest of the world. So that's intention all the time there, and that leads to its popularity, but also sometimes to some of the sort of weaknesses in his ideas, and then I think eventually to the downfall of some of his ideas.
That reference to romance seems apt, because when I was reading this, I thought, this is a picture of Wilkie falling in love with the world, yeah, and then feeling that the world has fallen in love back with him. And, in some ways, because he's a sort of symbol of the United States.
Considerable ego there too, yeah.
Yeah, but it also, I just thought, my God, we are not at that moment now, right? I mean, right now, the United States' leadership is less popular than it has been for a long stretch, and it's under a third of people in the world globally by polling approve of U.S. leadership, and the scorn is returned. I mean, the world has never been less popular in the United States in any time that I can remember from my political memory. So it just seems so bizarre, this moment that, I mean, it's not just this one guy, right? It's everyone around him is sort of invested in this project. And one question that I had was, to what degree does Wilkie have the blessing of people in power, right? Because he's just a citizen, he's not an official, but is he backed by the Roosevelt administration in his kind of romantic entreaties to the rest of the world?
So one thing I'd like to say about, I think it's important to understand about my book and about the story of Wilkie is that this is a story about more than foreign relations. It's really about, to use the Chicago Council's title, right? It's about global affairs. It's about someone trying to bring the world home to the people at large, and to do this through mass magazines, and to do this through bestsellers, and do this through speeches that 36 million people listen to on the radio, right? It's a story about the efflorescence of a a kind of relationship between the world for a few years during World War II that is open and possible, and that looks like it might break in unexpected directions. And Wilkie is really at the center of all that, and that's the popular internationalism I want to get at. Wilkie is a complicated figure for people who are in power at this moment. He is in some ways an ally of Roosevelt's, right? The big story we always have had about Wilkie is the way that he essentially, he helps the United States to get into World War II and thus save the world for democracy, because he doesn't attack Roosevelt during the 1940 election on foreign policy and on interventionism, right? But he quickly goes beyond Roosevelt. And he is much more of an anti-imperial thinker than Roosevelt is able to be because of his official power. And he's just more expansive and more informal than even Roosevelt is able to be. And Roosevelt has to be canny about what he thinks. And he has much more conventional sort of Brahmin ideals about the world. So one of the big dramas in this book is about the Atlantic Charter, right? That Roosevelt and Churchill signed in 1941, promising some measure of self-determination to the world's peoples. And of course, the world's peoples, many of the anti-imperialists across the world and countries around the world see this as a redux of 1919, when they hope to be able to come to Wilson at Versailles and say, please, we're here, we're ready for our freedom. And Wilson, of course, turns them down. And now the Atlantic Charter is before them again. They're skeptical, right? It becomes clear that they have reason to be skeptical when Churchill right away begins to backpedal on this. And Roosevelt, in his inimitable way, sort of makes everything vague and gestures at big capacious meaning for it. But it's Wilkie who becomes the kind of person around whom many people fix their hopes for fulfilling the Atlantic Charter, for making the Atlantic Charter actually a global document that will hopefully bring freedom to the peoples of the world, and to loose them from European empire, and to hopefully offset the rise of an American empire. Now, that's not exactly quite what happens, but that is where Wilkie stands in these few years between 1944 and 45 in relationship to those in power, right? He also stands in interesting relationship to those who are out of power. Right? So people on the left who see him as hopeful, but perhaps not critical enough of American empire, right, and American capitalism. Wilkie's a confident capitalist and unabashed capitalist, and a very much a modernizer, right? Someone who thinks that American modern can-do know-how and technological ideals which should be brought to the rest of the world, and that will help to spur this freedom, right? And that will, of course, become a far more complicated story in the years after the war. So Wilkie's an interesting relationship to different modes of American power and different people who are critics of that. It's kind of in an interesting way that he scrambles these different categories. He sort of operates in between them and takes from some people and takes other, right? I mean, he's in many ways a great champion of the African-American freedom struggle and its anti-imperialite visions, right? So he is a good friend of Walter White of the NAACP, and he campaigns for that in a way and brings those ideas into the mainstream in a way that I don't think any other public figure of this time was able to do, in a way that I don't think has been appreciated actually at all in our histories of this period.
Yeah, it is so extraordinary to read in your book, of this guy who's saying some fairly, I don't know, out there, but strongly worded things. So World War II has got to be, in Wilkie's view, a war for liberation, and liberation not just from Nazi Germany, not just from the Japanese Empire, but from the British Empire and the French Empire, and a liberation of all colonies. And this also, somehow, implicates the United States' imperialisms at homes. And he's concerned about, if the United States doesn't get civil rights correct, then, it's also, part of the problem, not part of the solution. And to hear that this is wildly popular, right? This book is just sort of, selling on newsstands and, selling at drugstores and just is selling like crazy. It's really amazing. So, but you keep hinting, you keep teasing as we're talking. You say, it's exciting and he's drawing on a lot of anti-imperial energy, but I also see a sort of darkness in its vision or some unanswered questions about the role of the United States. So maybe now is a moment when you can talk a little more about, the flip side of Wilkie's vision and some of your hesitations about it.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to see this as a possible popular vision that could accrued a constituency around it during World War II. And Wilkie was one of the foremost sort of white mainstream politicians to say the sorts of things that on the left and amongst African American campaigners was quite common. And he brought some of those things, as I said, into the mainstream. But there is also another kind of current running beneath the surface of Wilkie. And I think this has, when you read Wilkie's One World as kind of a popular nonfiction book, you see this, which is a kind of common current of American indispensability, a sort of sense of America as what one leftist critic calls the yardstick by which everything is measured, that sort of thing. That I think, to a certain extent shows that it was going to be very difficult for Wilkie's massive audience to go as far as people on the progressive left and the center left wanted Wilkie and his followers to be able to go. And so, there was always that there. But at the same time, right, he was seen, and the one world ideals were seen by people who were moving towards a more sort of what we would think of as a kind of Cold War position as quite a threat to a kind of more nationalistic, maybe soft nationalistic, liberal internationalist position, right? I mean, someone like Walter Lippmann, of course, who had been something of an ally of Wilkie's and thinks of himself as an anti-imperialist, also writes two books in 1943 and 44, two of his major books, he says, to disavow or to do away with, I can't remember the exact wording, with the one world vision, right? He's actively campaigning to try to beat that back as an alternative that might win support and guide American policy in what I think many people have thought of as a more sort of Rooseveltian direction, but I'd like to also see it as a Wilkian direction, right? So he sits in between all these things. There's kind of a current of American nationalism running through him, and I think through any figure who's able to win 23,000 votes of fellow American citizens, right? I mean, we think today of any figure who's been able to advance a kind of popular left idea about foreign policy would be Bernie Sanders, right? And his idea about partnerships with the world, right? But even that, right, as many people have pointed out, had as its ideal the Marshall Plan, which of course would have been, is one of the building blocks of liberal Cold War internationalism. For however you see that, for better or for worse, it's you're going to need that to appeal to many thousands of people the way Wilkie did, even in World War II. So that's one of the things that's at the heart of this. I think that it shows in part, it's hard to know because Wilkie dies in 1944, and it's hard to know exactly what would have happened. Would he have tacked to the right and become more of a kind of Cold War liberal? Would he have tacked to the left, more like a Henry Wallace, who was certainly to his left, but they shared a lot of the same ideas? And found a way to carve out a different position. One of the things people will learn if they read my book, just a teaser here, is of a possible rapprochement and combination of Roosevelt's liberal forces in the Democratic Party and Wilkie's in the Republican Party. And they hoped at near the end of Wilkie's life, unexpected, they didn't know he was going to die, to team up and try to do something new in American politics. I'll leave the details of that to readers, but it's an interesting, it's an interesting path not taken in American political and cultural life from that period.
Great. So first, I just want to remind everyone that have you got questions, you can type them, just type ccga.live into your browser and you'll be able to ask your questions. But Sandy, I have a question for you, which is, your book, am I right, was published in March of this year?
March 10th.
March 10th, right. Yeah, like just right before the pandemic hit. And
just before my university shut down all classes and sent all its students home. Yeah, right.
Yeah. And, I remember thinking about, just kind of contemplating that, right? And thinking, you just wrote a book about a guy who flies all over the world shaking hands, at a time when, that has become the thing that is unimaginable. So, but there's also a profound timeliness about this book, right? It does feel very urgent and it feels real now. So I'm wondering, why Wilkie now? Why? I mean,
yeah,
it's a sort of discarded future, but why is it a future that we need to pay attention to right now? Because I feel like it is.
Yeah, I think this is, more and more since the pandemic began, but also as I wrote the book in the last 5 or so years, I began to think about I began to think about what it was that the one world ideal helped us to think about. It's not a panacea. It doesn't help us to think about everything. It remains a kind of universalism with a certain set of blindnesses. It's also, that's how people see it on the left. On the right, people often see it as naive, right? As a kind of just sort of not hard-headed enough to deal with the world's actual problems. But what I do think that it does, and why I think it's particularly good for this moment, and has been an idea that might need to be, that really should be recalled, particularly since the end of the Cold War, is its insistence on our interdependence, right? It is about a book, it is an idea that helps us to confront, or suggests that we should confront, the world of globalization that we've been building ever since World War II. So, here's Wilkie going around the world during this time of global crisis in World War II. Here we are in our own moment of unprecedented global crisis, right? Probably the greatest one since World War II. We tend to think of World War II as this kind of heroic story, but I think the actors at the time experienced it as a time of great calamity. And I think that's another thing I'd like people to think about in my book. And Wilkie is an avatar of global connection, right? Of the need for us to think about what it means to be connected to people, and to think about an ethical set of relations between peoples everywhere, right? It's really hard to do this, right? And I think that this is part of the reason that one world eventually will fail. In most cases, as a way to organize all relations. But it does ask us to start to think specifically about how we can make real connections out of the interdependence that binds us all. I mean, I think it's absolutely necessary in a time when we are bound together by global communications, by greenhouse gases, of course, and now by a pandemic, right? It's the ethic that we need to start practicing, and the United States particularly, because the United States needs to recognize itself as connected to the rest of the world, as hard as that may be to do, and as frustrating as that has been, and the way it's been deployed over the last 20 years in an era of globalization, where globalization has served and helped people at the top of the economic spectrum and not so many people at the bottom, right? It's been, as globalization has driven inequality, it's been harder and harder to see how we might embrace this, right? Globalism has become a kind of shibboleth on the right, has been for many years, and Donald Trump has managed to make that official government policy now. We need to turn that back, but we also need to reconstruct globalism in a more democratic fashion. And I think the one world ideal gives us some ingredients to think about interdependency during a time of climate change and during a time of pandemics, in which we need to do it. It's absolutely imperative for the future of humanity. So I see the stakes that Wilkie lays out back during World War II as continuing and unsurpassed stakes.
Wonderful. So I'd like to turn to some audience questions, and we have a few of them. ccga.live if you want to add another or vote on some. One question concerns my favorite chapter, which is you have this amazing chapter on Wilkie going to China, where but he falls in love with China, and then also there's this elaborate stage play whereby, every sort of thing is managed about his visit, and Chinese people are given U.S. flags to wave as he goes by, and it doesn't occur to him to wonder, where did they get those flags? Of course, the government is handing them out.
Well, he sort of knows.
He knows. Okay.
He kind of knows it's staged. All of it is being staged with him, but he also kind of doesn't care. He also kind of wants to believe it. Wilkie, this is where Wilkie's enthusiasm, his bravado, his iconoclasm, and his boisterousness kind of gets the best of him, right? And he sort of seems to know this, but loves it anyway.
Right. And so that's what, that's what I want to get at. So he kind of gets that he's being handled. And of course, everyone who's from the United States who's on the ground is telling him the nationalist government here is totally corrupt. They're completely playing you. You're the useful idiot. And he just he falls in love, including, you kind of get at, possibly literally, in the sense that he seems to, at least we have secondhand reports of him confessing his love for Madame Chiang Kai-shek and possibly having engaged in an affair with her while he's over there. So it feels like it's very metaphorical, very personal. But what do you make of that? It's such an interesting moment, because on the one hand, he's affirming this non-white government that and affirming its ability to be not under the control of any European power. But on the other hand, he does seem like he's sort of playing into its hands and not recognizing the, as you say, the corruption and the brutality of the government.
Right.
So the questioner also asked what might Wilkie have made of China in 2020, but I think it's the same question of like, how do you deal with a country that is big, powerful, independent, ideally independent of European powers, but also might have problems of its own?
Right. I mean, Wilkie falls hard for China. There's no like way around that, and it wouldn't be interesting to try to deny that. It's part of what makes his moment in China particularly interesting, right? So, from the lens that we often have about the nationalists and about the world of pre-revolution China, right? We understand that the Zhang government was fairly corrupt, and I think had literally risen out of a quite violent banishing and destruction of their rivals, right? Whether it was warlords or the communists under Mao or other groups that were jockeying across the 20 years that they came to power for power. And so Wilkie doesn't quite understand all this. I don't think he sort of knows it, but he isn't. That's not what's important to him. What's important to him is something more of a long game, right? He wants to work with. And there's something that happens like this with his attempts to work with Stalin as well.
Yeah.
He wants to work with Zhang and Madame Zhang to try to make an anti-imperial world, right? This isn't just the moment when the Western powers give up their extraterritoriality claims in China, which is an important moment for the Chinese, huge moment for the Chinese, right? Really underappreciated in the West, and for many other anti-imperialists around the globe who have seen that the institutions of the treaty ports, which were so powerful in shaping empire, European empire and American empire over China, are being given up in this moment. This happens right after Wilkie spends 2 weeks in China. He had very little to do with it in the end, but he gets some of the measure of credit for this sudden need to transform our relations to China and to see them as an actor on the global stage, right? Zhang and Madame Zhang have just returned from meetings with Gandhi and Nehru in India, right? They're all plotting what will become the non-aligned movement later. That will take shape in a different kind of way once the war between Mao and Zhang heats up. But Wilkie's looking at this and saying, I want the United States to be aligned with the anti-imperial forces in China, right? He doesn't quite understand, even though he does get to talk with Zhou Enlai a bit, and gets a kind of dissenting view from Zhou Enlai as well as Americans, and that's kind of fascinating. But he kind of wants to put all that off and see how it works out, just as he does with Stalin, where he wants us to sort of keep working with Stalin so as to offset what will become the Cold War and allow decolonization to take place and to usher on the world stage faster than most people wanted it to try to make a more equitable world. So that's his kind of strategic view that I think people hadn't really seen, fraught as it was with perils, particularly with Stalin, I think. But it was an idea that many at that time on the left and the sort of liberal left, and even Roosevelt really kind of shared. Like, let's work with these folks to try to open the world up a little bit.
Yeah, you say that, one version is that Wilkie's just a dupe, right? That he, Stalin's playing him, the Chinese government's playing him. He just doesn't really understand what's happening internally in these places. And what you kind of propose in your book is that he's not a dupe, but also he understands that global comedy is going to some version of just, I don't know, holding your nose, but, that would be reprehensible for Wilkie, were they happening in the United States? And that's a complicated moral thing, but I mean,
it is.
You defend it. You explain what he's thinking.
Well, I want to, so much as defend it, I want to explain why people took that position during that time and why it was a form of strategy that 5 to 10 years later would only be embraced by people on the far left and would be, when Wallace proposes it, 5 years, 6 years later, he had been proposing it at that time too. He was sort of run out of American political life, but there was more room for that in American political life during the war. Soviets were our allies, obviously. We were only beginning to know about some of the things that happened in the Soviet Union. But there's quite a bit of evidence, as people who've worked in the Soviet archives have shown us, right, is that Stalin was willing to work with the United States on certain things, right? There were certain lines he didn't want to cross around Eastern Europe, and the sort of fortification of his Western boundaries in Eastern Europe. And we will continue to have debates about that in the history of foreign policy. But I think this was an interesting strategic moment where Wilkie brought that possibility of thinking strategically and long term around the Soviet Union and China, and what he thought of as the sort of the great undecided peoples of the world, primarily for him in the Middle East. He didn't reach other parts of the world where that was also at stake, but who were waiting for the United States to decide whether it was going to cast its lot with the old system of empire or with a new kind of more interdependent world. And the United States, in some sense, split the difference there, right, in the post-World War.
So we also have a question about the C word that we have largely avoided, capitalism. We haven't completely avoided it. You have mentioned it, but I think the big question is this one world vision, is it essentially a vision about equality, or is it a world where all the walls have been knocked down, particularly for the United States? So this is a world opened up to cocoa colonization, where U.S. corporations can go anywhere, partly because other countries aren't ensconced in empires that might put up trade barriers. And this is not a vision for a world free of empire. This is just a vision of a world that is sort of served up for a different kind of empire. And of course, as Harold Ickey said of Wilkie, he's the barefoot boy from Wall Street. Obviously he's very closely related to a lot of these corporations that works for them. So how did you end up seeing that in the end?
Well, so what's interesting is to see Wilkie trying to sort out this problem as his ideas about the world change, as he finds the world in his trip, and as he writes his book, and as he fields this criticism from the left during these years, right? This is what's so fascinating about this moment, is that we are at this hinge moment where the United States is on the cusp of taking over guardianship of the world capitalist system from the British Empire, right? And we have several different stories about how that happens and what happens after World War II with this. And what's interesting about Wilkie is to see the way that he's grappling with this problem. Wilkie is a capitalist, right? There's no doubt about that, right? He is a huge believer in free trade. So in some sense, yes, Wilkie's one world is a free trade world. And I have lots of debates with people about what that means in 1942, 43, and 45, right? It means something slightly different, I think, for Wilkie than it does for someone like Cordell Hull, who's the other great advocate in these years of free trade, which is, and the British are very forthright about that. Like, of course they want free trade because that'll benefit the United States. And I think Wilkie took Wilkie a while to see this, to not really understand. And I talk about this in the book, but he didn't quite understand that what he was doing was by sort of ushering in this kind of universalist idea of one world and putting free trade in hand with it. He wanted it to be a world where there were no boundaries for anyone to participate. Like, that's what he wanted. But I don't think that he understood the balance of power perhaps as powerfully as he might have. And as many of his critics, who were quick to say, again, you're measuring everything by an American yardstick, that was what Max Lerner, the popular front writer, said, and you don't understand the power of our corporations. I think he said that he used the phrase corporations and cartels to determine the global economy and what will happen if we just unleash free trade in the world, right? So, for Wilkie, this was a vexed problem, right? He had come to political notice in the 30s as a big advocate of free enterprise, right? And this was he was a big advocate of that. But he drops that term over the course of the 40s because he begins to see it as unequal and unfair and kind of camouflaging the power. He never quite gets there, as far as I'm aware, with free trade, but you can see him trying to sort of struggling with this problem. And that's, again, why he's a great lens into this dilemma at the heart of this moment.
Yeah. Am I correct in remembering that Ayn Rand worked on his 1940 campaign?
Yeah, two of the most interesting people who worked on Wilkie's campaign were Ayn Rand on the one hand, right, who was sort of disgusted with him for being not sort of doctrinaire enough, I think. And then one of my another figure I've worked on quite a bit in the sort of urbanist world, Jane Jacobs, the writer who writes Death and Life in Great American Cities, also was a volunteer on his campaign, and quickly grew to dislike him because she thought he was totally untrustworthy. And Jane Jacobs was a sharp judge of character, so it's interesting.
So our next question, and we've got about 5 minutes to give you some sense of time, but our next question is, what would have happened if Wilkie had won that campaign, either maybe the 1940 campaign or the 1944 one where he ran in the primary? And I guess another way of asking that would be to ask, what did we lose by Wilkie's defeat and death, by this being a discarded future rather than one that was affirmed?
Right. I think in 1940 we would have seen very little difference from what we actually got. I mean, I think that you probably would have seen perhaps a bigger role for African Americans in American political life, oddly enough, who had to force their way onto the stage during the war. Wilkie ran with a pledge to create an anti-lynching law, something that Roosevelt could never do because of the white supremacists in his coalition, the Democratic coalition. The Pittsburgh Courier endorsed him. Right, that's one thing we might have seen. On the global stage, though, I think we would have been sort of the same configuration of into the war. But I think the 1944 campaign is, I think, the one that really positions Wilkie for a different possible future. And particularly, I think what we would have seen was him attempt, if he had gotten the power to do so, and what he thought of as the sort of power of the bully pulpit of the presidency, would have been his attempt to try to make the United Nations a more democratic and less hierarchical institution. Right? He would have pushed for what he thought of as the council of all the United Nations, all the allies, right, to come together long before the war was over, right, not just in secret in the planning that went on in the State Department in those years, right, and not just not lodging all the power in the Security Council with the veto, but something that would open the world up a little bit more. That's the possibility. Now, the politics would have fallen one way or another, and there was a lot, as we've seen from the way the way the UN really played out. There was a lot of resistance to that. And so I don't know how it would have played out, but I think that would have been what Wilkie would have pushed for had he had the power. He was only able to argue for those things in magazines and in newspapers and in speeches in 1943 and 44. And most of what was going on in the shaping of the UN up until he dies. He dies the weekend, if I remember this correctly, he dies the weekend that the Dumbarton Oaks Conference is actually convened. Or maybe that's when he goes into the hospital, I'm forgetting now. But, so he doesn't know much of what's going on, as most people didn't know, right? Because it was all being done in secret, right? Inside the State Department for the most part, right? It's not, some of that leaks out into newspaper and magazine stories in 1944 that show that Roosevelt is thinking about the structure that would eventually become the Security Council dominated UN. But I think Wilkie would have pushed for something more open, more democratic, more distributed, more decentralized, perhaps. I don't know where that would have been led.
Let me ask you this final question, and I suppose we'll have to be brief, but you talk about sort of what Wilkie would have wanted in a poli-sci kind of way or an IR way. And we're living in a world that has been radically transformed in the other way that Wilkie cared about, which is people moving from one spot to another and getting to know each other. So how does that aspect of the Wilkie vision kind of hold up in the age of COVID-19?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is what's so hard to tell right now. Particularly in this country, we're such a divided population around these questions that have been politicized so explicitly around those of us who are cosmopolitan elites and those of us who remain tied to the nation and to our local communities, right? I think, the hope is that looking back to something like One World can sort of try to loosen up some of those really fixed poles and to find new ways for people to connect to some kind of new orientation for a kind of a global politics that's more democratic and includes more people, right? That's what I think Wilkie's vision allows us to start thinking about, right? predicted in some ways the one world of globalization. I don't think it quite went the way he perhaps would have wanted, although some of his ideas are what influenced it, like free trade, right? But I think that, that dilemma continues. It's our own dilemma still today. And as I said before, I think these are the unsurpassed stakes of this vision and this idea about the world. And I think we would do well to do some reflecting on it. And that's why I wrote the book. And that's what I hope to keep thinking about as we go forward on our really unsure and treacherous path these days.
Great. I think that's a apt moment and a helpful one on which to end. So let me just first thank Professor Zipp for agreeing to do this. Thank the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for hosting it. Thank you for watching it. And remind you that this book is available, including through the link from Seller Books, or Bookseller. So please buy it, and I think you'll enjoy it quite a lot.
Thank you, everybody.